So much for the anti-war candidate, eh?
Yeah, exactly. And Trump bombed 7 countries in 2025 alone while calling himself a peace president.
Can you talk about what your strongest evidence is?
Well, Donald Trump said it like 20 times. One of the charges is possession of machine guns in violation of U.S. gun law. It took a war in Venezuela for Republicans to actually support gun control for the first time.
Would you go as far as saying the silver lining is that the mask is falling with Trump?
I wouldn't call it a silver lining.
Many of the voices online that are supportive of what the U.S. did said that this actually acts as an example as to why countries can't rely on China or Russia because they didn't show up to help. So what do you think about this argument? Is it also hypocritical in the other direction for people who empathized with Russia or even outright supported what Russia did, yet denounce what the U.S. did in Venezuela? Are they too hypocritical? Welcome back to the Dumbrill Podcast. We are tackling the explosive U.S. bombing of Venezuela on January 3rd, 2026, and the kidnapping of President Maduro, a crisis screaming imperialism with strikes on cities, resource grabs, and colonial conquest straight out of the Monroe Doctrine playbook. In this era of crumbling sovereignty, we expose the truth behind these power plays shaking the global south. Joining me today is Ben Norton, editor-in-chief of Geopolitical Economy Report. We will briefly summarize some of Ben's existing analysis published on his channel and cover a bit of new ground. To dive even deeper into any of the items we'll be summarizing here, I highly recommend checking out Ben's channel, the Geopolitical Economy Report. Ben, great to have you back, and thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me, Daniel. It's always a pleasure. And I have to say, I'm looking forward to this conversation because some of the analysis that I have done, I will say, it's been very, very much vindicated because Trump administration officials have come out and admitted exactly what people like you and I have been talking about how this attack on Venezuela is also a threat against China and Russia, how the U.S. is trying to impose hegemony in the regions. It's trying to bring back the, Monroe Doctrine. They've openly said it. They're proud of it.
Exactly. So with that, let's start right from the beginning then. So let's get into what the key reasons are as to why this is happening according to your analysis. Give us an overview that will help us better understand exactly what's going on here, basically.
Yeah, there are, of course, several different factors playing in. And I have to say that if you want to understand the kind of larger imperial strategy, it is very useful to read the 2025 National Security Strategy that was published at the end of last year by the Trump White House. And they lay it all out. They say that the Western Hemisphere is the most important region. They do say that in the medium to the long term, strategic competition and conflict with China is the biggest priority. But in the short term, what they see as their top priority is imposing hegemony in the Western Hemisphere, especially Latin America. But this is also why they want to colonize Greenland, and they're even threatening Canada. But in terms of Latin America, they are bringing back this 200-year-old colonial Monroe Doctrine that essentially declares that the U.S. should control all of Latin America. It's part of the U.S. imperial sphere of influence, or the imperial backyard. And the U.S. wants to remove any independent government in the region and exploit the strategic infrastructure and control all of the important natural resources in the region. And this is part of a larger strategy to try to create a new supply chain that cuts out China. We know that China has become the world's largest economy when its GDP is measured at purchasing power parity since 2016, 10 years ago now. And China is the manufacturing superpower. And the US has recognized that its economy has been deindustrialized, and it's very dependent on China for manufacturing. And global supply chains are largely dominated by China because China has invested over many decades in building that manufacturing capacity and building up those supply chains. Whereas the US, neoliberal philosophy in this, neoliberal era since the 1990s is essentially that, it doesn't matter if you can actually manufacture anything locally. You can offshore all of that production. These corporations can go and exploit low-paid labor in other countries. All the supply chain is located in other countries. This is the era of neoliberal globalization. And instead, the U.S. economy would be based on finance and high value-added services. And we see that with the fragmentation of this, globalized order and the increasing weaponization of trade by the U.S., we see that the U.S. really wants to try to decouple economically from China and create a new supply chain. And the idea is the U.S. wants to use all of the Western Hemisphere as kind of this new base to exploit the natural resources in the region, exploit the low-paid workers of Latin America, so US corporations can create new factories and new supply chains that are taken out of Asia as the US prepares for future conflict with Asia. And I have to say, I mean, we're recording now on the 8th of January. And just a few hours ago, Donald Trump announced that he's this year expanding the military budget from $1 trillion to $1.5 trillion, which is already crazy because the insane US military budget now of $1 trillion is more than the next 10 largest military spenders in the world combined. And yet now with 1.5 trillion, it's going to be like basically the entire world's military spending combined will be the US military spending. So it's all clear that this is leading toward
candidate, eh?
Yeah, exactly. And Trump bombed 7 countries in 2025 alone while calling himself a peace president. So, I mean,
Right.
everything shows how this is all part of a larger strategy that is aimed toward imperial consolidation, solidifying control over this region to prepare for future conflict. And unfortunately, I hate to say this, but I think the attack in Venezuela is actually part of a larger campaign. The US is already threatening Cuba and Colombia. They're already talking about colonizing Greenland. And basically, I mean, the idea is to take over this entire region. And they're now proud of it. They're not even hiding it.
Yeah, it does sound like it's going to create a trickle-down effect. And he's going to be, I mean, he got away with this, and it looked like it was so easy also. And we'll get into that more in a second. But what I want to do, because this is important too, can you talk about what your strongest evidence is that control over Venezuela's natural resources like oil, gas, gold, and rare earth minerals is a primary or large driver of this conflict?
Well, Donald Trump said it like 20 times in the press conference he gave after bombing Venezuela and kidnapping President Maduro. He said, we're taking the oil. U.S. corporations are going in to exploit the oil. They're going to spend billions of dollars investing in this oil. He said, we're going to take great amount of wealth out of the ground. We're going to make so much money. He just kept repeating it, which is very funny because you know how Trump is. He starts a press conference by reading a few notes, and then he just goes off script and says what he actually believes. And he started the press conference reading some notes, and he said, this is because of drugs and security. And then he just went off and he's like, no, oil, oil, oil. He just kept saying it again and again and again. And now there have been more and more reports in the mainstream media talking about how the Trump administration is making these demands of Venezuela. And it has 2 main demands. If the government, so Trump did not succeed in full regime change. He did kidnap President Maduro, but the government has not fallen. But the Trump administration Trump himself claimed that they're going to run Venezuela. And a lot of journalists said, what does that mean? Like, what does that look like? And Trump pointed behind him and he said, we here are going to run Venezuela. And he pointed to Marco Rubio, Secretary of State and National Security Advisor. He also pointed to Pete Hegseth, the Secretary of War. And he pointed, and alongside them was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the head of the military. So he said that the U.S. is going to run Venezuela. It's not been clear what that looks like. We now see that Venezuela has an interim president, an acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, who was the vice president, and constitutionally, she's now the acting president. And the Trump administration has openly threatened her. Trump said publicly, he said, if she doesn't do what the U.S. wants, her fate will be worse than Maduro's, is what he said. And also, there have been many reports that the Trump administration is threatening to kidnap or potentially even assassinate other top government officials in Venezuela, including the Interior Minister, Diosdado Cabello, and including the Defense Minister, Vladimir Padrino. And basically what they're saying is if these officials do not go along with what the U.S. wants, they will be disappeared, kidnapped, executed. And there are 2 main demands. The first is that Venezuela has to cut off all political and economic ties with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba, which is crazy because China is the largest trading partner of Venezuela. And by the way, China is the largest trading partner of South America, period,
Right.
of almost all the countries in the region. And Trump just announced, as part of this kind of colonial plan, that Venezuela is being forced to only buy goods from the U.S. Literally, he's telling Venezuela they cannot do trade with China. It's already crazy enough to tell an independent sovereign country that it cannot have political relations with China and Russia and Iran. but saying they can't even have economic relations is just straight up medieval colonial. I mean, it's just like colonial. This is crazy. You're telling a country they cannot trade with China.
Right.
And then, so the other demand, which is related to that, of course, is the Trump administration is saying openly that Venezuela is only allowed to sell its oil to the US. And the US will then decide what happens with that oil. And Trump said, okay, maybe we will sell Venezuelan oil. We will sell Venezuelan oil to China as if it were US oil. But the message is very clear. Trump said that Venezuela can only sell oil to the US. And in particular, the US wants Venezuela's heavy crude, which is part of a kind of larger geopolitical game here, because the US actually is the world's largest producer of oil, and it's actually a net exporter of oil. However, the US does still import a lot of oil because not all crude is exactly the same, right? The US mostly produces light crude, and yet it imports a lot of heavy crude. More than 60% of US oil imports are heavy crude, which are needed for certain kind of machinery and certain large vehicles. And also they need it for asphalt and a lot of industrial applications. So the US mostly, it imports 75% of that heavy crude from Canada, which is largely tar sands oil. And the US, obviously, Trump has been putting a lot of pressure on Canada. And they say this is also a way to increase the leverage they have over Canada, because the US is dependent on importing heavy crude from Canada. And most of the rest of it comes from Mexico. And this year, there are renegotiations happening for the USMCA, the free trade agreement formerly known as NAFTA. So Trump wants to maximize the leverage he has over both Canada and Mexico. And by replacing that heavy crude with Venezuelan crude, it's another card he can play against Canada and Mexico. So, I mean, this is, it's all just kind of this Machiavellian kind of imperial game of geopolitical chess, where the US is just bullying these countries and saying, we control your natural resources.
Yeah, I mean, you can't. There's so much evidence there that tells you exactly what this is about. To tell that country that who they can and cannot do business with, when they're saying, in the beginning at least, obviously Trump is a little bit more honest, when they're saying that the reason they need to get rid of their current leader is because he wasn't fairly elected and the people need to decide their own fate. They need to elect their own leader. Well, what if the people want to deal with China? They're not even giving them that option. So, obviously the evidence goes above and beyond that. This clearly, of course, is not about this so-called drug issue also, but can you talk about what your main evidence is that it has nothing to do with drugs, and drugs isn't really a priority of theirs whatsoever anyways, even if it was an issue?
Yeah, well, first of all, because the U.S. is allied with the worst drug traffickers in the region. And a few weeks ago, Donald Trump pardoned and released from prison one of the worst drug traffickers on earth, Juan Orlando Hernandez, who is the former dictator of Honduras, a close U.S. ally, right-wing politician. And he was imprisoned for trafficking 400 tons of cocaine, which is absolutely crazy when you think about how much that is. And he was just pardoned. And Trump claimed that he was a victim of political persecution. Meanwhile, they imprisoned Maduro and kidnapped him. And it's absolutely crazy. He was the sitting president. They just kidnapped him. And now he's going through a show trial in New York. And by the way, the judge overseeing the show trial is 92 years old, which is a great symbol of the decadence of, this horrible, decadent U.S. empire. But anyway, getting back to this main question you have. So the argument that the U.S. government made for many years, going back to the first Trump administration, is that supposedly Maduro was the leader of a cartel, which was part of this campaign to delegitimize him as a president, recognized by the vast majority of countries on earth and the United Nations. The U.S. says, oh, he's not a real president, so we didn't kidnap a president. And their argument is we don't recognize him. And they say, he's not recognized by the international community, by which they mean the Western white countries. He means the US and Europe. But actually, the vast majority of UN member states, like around 80%, did recognize and still do recognize Maduro as the constitutional president. And he's still recognized by the United Nations, by international law. So Trump claimed in his first term, actually, his administration, his DOJ claimed, the Department of Justice said that Maduro was the leader of a drug cartel, and they claimed he was the leader of something called the Cartel de los Soles. the Suns cartel, which doesn't exist. And and not just me, but many other people were pointing out that this does not exist for many months in the past year, because when Trump came in his second term, Marco Rubio announced that the U.S. State Department had recognized the so-called Cartel de los Soles as a terror organization, which is absurd. And I and other people pointed out it literally does not exist. It is a fabrication used by Venezuela's right-wing opposition and the U.S. government to claim that conveniently all of the top members of the Venezuelan government are part of a so-called cartel. Because if you look at the list they made of the so-called leaders of this cartel, it just so happens to be the president, the vice president, the top ministers of the Venezuelan government. It's a farce. And even some mainstream media outlets in the past few months admitted that this doesn't exist. Even CNN admitted it doesn't exist. France 24 also. And now what's so funny is after, in a sadistic way, is after the U.S. kidnapped Maduro, the DOJ is actually having to oversee this show trial against Maduro. And they were forced to admit in court that the so-called Suns cartel doesn't actually exist. So they have actually completely changed their argument. Originally, that was their argument. Now they're saying that Maduro his government oversaw cocaine trafficking, but they're no longer making this false claim that he's part of a cartel, which once again shows how it was always a lie from the very beginning. And then finally,
right, yeah, I think they updated the indictment on the fly also, right? They had to change the indictment while he was in custody because of that reason.
Exactly. And also, one of the charges against Maduro, it's such a joke. It's just a farce. One of the charges is possession of machine guns in violation of U.S. gun law, which is why people are joking that it took a war in Venezuela for Republicans to actually support gun control for the first time. But also, first of all, this is a foreigner. He's not possessing guns in U.S. territory, so the U.S. can't just charge him. And it's not just that. He's a foreign head of state. The U.S. is saying he doesn't have sovereign immunity as a foreign head of state because they don't recognize him as a head of state. But again, international law recognizes him as head of state. And by the way, this whole nonsense about like democracy, the U.S. has always supported. I mean, first of all, Venezuela is not a dictatorship. There's this propaganda. They keep saying it's a dictatorship. And yet the president has been kidnapped and the government didn't fall. So it's obviously not a dictatorship, because if it were really a dictatorship, Maduro would be kidnapped and the government would collapse. So again, it shows how absurd it is. But it's so absurd, especially considering that the U.S. has supported dictators across Latin America for many decades and across the world. I mean, do you think the U.S. is now going to kidnap the Saudi crown prince, Mohammed bin Salman? No, he's a U.S. ally. It's just such a joke. Like, the U.S. has no problem with dictators, ever. Maduro's not a dictator, but it wouldn't matter. Even if he were, they would have no problem with that. They don't like leaders who are independent. Now, finally, one other quick point about drugs. I mean, I could spend a long time talking about this, but I'll simplify it. If you look across the region, for many decades, the U.S. has been closely allied with drug traffickers in Latin America. So, for instance, I mentioned this Hypocrisy in Honduras, this U.S.-backed drug dealer. But in Ecuador right now, there's a right-wing pro-U.S. president who's very close to Trump. His name is Daniel Noboa. He's the richest. He's from the richest family in the country, the son of the richest billionaire in Ecuador. And everyone knows police documents from Ecuador have shown that his family is involved in cocaine trafficking. This has been reported widely in the Ecuadorian media and even some in the U.S. media, that his family, they have private ports and they put cocaine in their banana crates that are exported to the U.S. and Europe. He's one of the closest U.S. allies. Marco Rubio was just meeting with him a few months ago. Then you look at Colombia. In Colombia, the closest U.S. allies in the country are also drug dealers. So the former president of Colombia, Álvaro Uribe, who's a right-wing ally of Trump and a close personal friend of Marco Rubio, last year, Marco Rubio was publicly tweeting in his capacity as Secretary of State, praising Álvaro Uribe, and because Uribe was facing legal charges for his corruption in Colombia, and the U.S. State Department was meddling in Colombia's justice system to defend this known drug trafficker, U.S. declassified documents from U.S. intelligence agencies have shown that Álvaro Uribe is one of the biggest drug traffickers in Colombia, and he was working with the Medellin cartel and Pablo Escobar. And yet this is the guy who is the president of Colombia and is a close U.S. ally. And by the way, the ultimate irony on top is he was president in the 2000s when George W. Bush was president. And that was the peak of the so-called war on terror. The war on terror and the war on drugs, right? And Alvaro Uribe, as he was helping to lead a drug cartel as the leader of Colombia, he was also helping the U.S. government lead the so-called war on drugs in Latin America. I mean, if people have done any research on the war on drugs, the U.S. war on drugs, it's the biggest farce ever, like the war on terror, by the way. I mean, we saw that the U.S. helped put the former leader of Al-Qaeda in power in Syria after waging the so-called war on terror for 20 years. So literally, the war on terror led to Al-Qaeda taking state power, just as the war on drugs waged by the U.S. was about helping drug cartels take state power, and like they did in Honduras and Colombia. And in the case of Mexico, by the way, the leader, the right-wing Bush ally, who was the president of Mexico in the 2000s, was Felipe Calderon, who was also overseeing the so-called war on drugs in Mexico in alliance with the U.S. And his head of security was also working with the drug cartels. He was paid tens of millions of dollars of bribes from cartels like the Sinaloa cartel. And he was also imprisoned for corruption so it's just like, literally, I'm not exaggerating. Literally, if you know anything about the history of Latin America, the U.S. government is allied with the worst drug traffickers in the region. And basically, if you are not corrupt and you are not a drug trafficker, you are much more likely to be targeted by the U.S. for regime change and a coup or kidnapping.
Right. So it's kind of twofold. It's, first of all, there's no evidence of an actual drug problem, significant drug problem from Venezuela. And even if there was, that's not something the U.S. cares about anyway. I mean, the narrative is completely ridiculous. I remember also seeing that they were trying to push this idea that they use their oil industry to fund their drug industry. It's like, hold on a second. The drug industry would be a profit-making center by itself. You don't need an oil industry to fund a drug industry. But as ridiculous as all of this is to anybody who has their eyes open, I feel like it's almost a requirement that they have to put something out, even if it's ridiculous, so that people who want to still claim moral high ground can hold on to something and they can just say it, even if they know it's ridiculous, even if they know it doesn't make any sense. But they'll say, oh, we had to do it because he's a drug dealer, even though deep down inside they don't really believe that and they're supporting imperialism. But what I'm kind of
Daniel,
go ahead.
One other quick point on this. I forgot to mention. If you look at UN data, so the UN runs an office on drugs and crime. They have international data. They're completely independent. They have shown that Venezuela is completely insignificant in the cocaine trade. Now, Colombia is the biggest producer of cocaine on earth by far. Venezuela produces almost none. And there's a little trafficking of cocaine through Venezuela, but it's very minor. A lot of the cocaine that goes to the U.S. actually goes through the Pacific, like the Eastern Pacific, and it goes through Ecuador. I mentioned Ecuador is currently governed by an oligarch's son whose family is deeply involved in cocaine trafficking, and the Trump administration loves him. But Venezuela's role in drug trafficking is just completely insignificant according to UN data. And then when you go to fentanyl, it's just a complete joke. Venezuela has nothing to do whatsoever with fentanyl, which is responsible for the not just fentanyl, synthetic opioids, according to U.S. government data, are responsible for the vast majority of drug deaths in the U.S., not cocaine. And yet now the Trump administration has been trying to create this crazy narrative that like Maduro is responsible for the drug overdose deaths in the U.S., when in reality, the vast majority of those overdoses were because of synthetic opioids, not just because of fentanyl, but also because of pharmaceutical corporations like big pharma companies like Purdue Pharma, especially OxyContin. About half of U.S. opioid deaths were from OxyContin, which was this drug created by Purdue Pharma, run by this billionaire oligarch family, the Sacklers. And many states in the U.S., like the state governments, because it's a federal system, they had class action lawsuits against Purdue Pharma because of the role of this company in causing the opioid epidemic that led to hundreds of thousands of deaths in the U.S. It had nothing to do with Venezuela, yet alone cocaine. So there's this insanely cynical narrative, like trying to blame all of this on Venezuela when it had nothing to do with it. And it's so reminiscent of the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, right? The whole weapons of mass destruction, WMD myth, where the U.S. government tried to convince people that Saddam Hussein was involved with in 9/11, which is like the stupidest thing ever. He had absolutely nothing to do with it, just as they're trying to convince people that Maduro was responsible for the opioid epidemic. But unfortunately, I don't think most people actually believe this. But like you said, unfortunately, it's so low effort. But like people just turn off their brain and like, okay, whatever. Like that's the argument they go with. And like a few people, maybe they do believe it. But when you do some basic evidence, just as like a lot of journalists, not mainstream journalists, but alternative journalists in the lead up to the invasion of Iraq, they could clearly see that the whole WMD thing was also a lie. It shows how low effort the propaganda is still today.
It is really low effort. Yeah. Now, for the region, do you think that this is going to kick off a domino effect? Do you think, in Latin America, the Caribbean, wherever it is, do you think that what are the implications for the region, basically?
Well, I wouldn't say domino effect, because actually I think in many ways it's going to backfire politically. We see that this year there are elections coming up, very important elections in October in Brazil, which is the biggest country in Latin America, and also in May, just in a few months, in Colombia. And the US is openly meddling already in those elections to try to put in power right-wing US puppets, because both countries currently have left-wing leaders. Lula da Silva in Brazil, who's one of the co-founders of BRICS, very close to China, very critical of US interventionism in the region. And the US, Trump has been open about the fact that he wants to push Lula out of power. Trump put 50% tariffs on Brazil, despite the fact that Brazil actually has a trade deficit with the US, which is very funny because Trump falsely claims that his tariffs are about reducing the US trade deficit with countries like China. And yet he put some of the highest tariffs on Brazil and India, and the US has a trade surplus with Brazil, but it has 50% tariffs on Brazil, which is, it's a political tool, and it's also targeting BRICS. Trump said very clearly he's targeting BRICS. So Brazil is one of the targets, and actually I think all of these attacks will help Lula. Lula is already leading in the polls in the upcoming election, and unless the US does something absolutely crazy, like try to assassinate Lula or kidnap Lula or invade Brazil, and by the way, that would be even crazier because Brazil has a very significant military. It's the biggest and most powerful military in the region. I mean, they couldn't really defend themselves against the US, which is obviously the most powerful military, but they could put up more of a fight at least. Unless there's something absolutely crazy like that, it's almost certain that Lula will win that election. And these attacks are actually strengthening Lula because the right wing in Brazil, the Bolsonaro supporters, are so extremely pro-US and pro-Trump and supported this attack in Venezuela that like even a lot of people who are not that political, they just look at this and they're saying like, you guys are traitors. Like you are literally selling out your country and inviting a foreign power to invade us. And that's not popular, obviously. In Colombia, similar story. Like Colombia, their constitution only allows one term for presidents. So the current president, Gustavo Petro, is not up for re-election. He's been very outspoken in criticizing U.S. imperialism. And by the way, he's been very outspoken in support of Palestine. And the Trump administration put sanctions on the sitting president, Gustavo Petro, which is absolutely crazy. I mean, like, he's the democratically elected president of Colombia, which again shows how the U.S. doesn't care about democracy. And the U.S. has been openly meddling in that upcoming election in May. But again, these attacks actually could help him because now Trump is threatening to invade Colombia. So again, like this idea that the U.S. has that it can just force all of the countries in the region to roll over and do what it wants, it's much easier said than done. Now, that said, the U.S. can cause a lot of damage and chaos. And the point I like to make is that, when you look at the history of U.S. imperialism, the U.S. is really good at destroying countries and destabilizing countries and causing chaos and mass suffering and mass migration like it did in Iraq. The U.S. is not good at making puppet governments that actually stay in power. Like, look what happened in Iraq. The U.S. invaded Iraq. More than 1 million Iraqis died. And now Iraq has a government today that is still pretty independent. And, the U.S. doesn't control Iraq's oil like it wanted to. Like, it's much easier said than done, right? There was so much resistance. And the only way the U.S. could maintain control of Iraq is maintaining U.S. military occupation. And there was resistance, and so many U.S. troops died, they withdrew, right? The same thing in Afghanistan. Like, Afghanistan is one of the poorest countries on earth The US occupied it for 20 years and they couldn't hold on to it. The puppet, literally, I'm not even joking, literally the puppet regime in Afghanistan collapsed in 1 week, within a few days after the US withdrew. So the US now thinks it can do that in Venezuela. Good luck. Venezuela is a big country, 30 million people, a lot of nationalists who are willing to fight for their country. There are a lot of guns in Venezuela. So the US has this strategy, like they want to impose imperial hegemony across the region and control all of the countries. But like I said, I mean, it's easy to say that, but it's actually very difficult to put that into practice. And then finally, by the way, this issue of trade in China. I mentioned that China is the largest trading partner of South America. And now Trump is openly saying that he wants countries not only to cut off political ties. We knew that. If you read the national security strategy, they say that they don't want China to have political ties with countries in the region. And especially they want to force the countries of the region to where China has invested to help build infrastructure in the Belt and Road Initiative. They want to force all of the countries in the region to withdraw from the BRI and to force China to sell its investment in these infrastructure projects. So, for instance, Marco Rubio, in his first trip abroad as Secretary of State, he went to Panama and he forced Panama to withdraw from the Belt and Road Initiative. And also Trump forced the Panamanian government to pressure the Hong Kong company that owns 2 ports on both sides of the Panama Canal, which is it's not a state-owned enterprise. It's not a mainland Chinese company. It's a private Hong Kong company called CK Hutchinson. And they agreed to sell their stake in these Panamanian ports to BlackRock, the world's largest asset manager on Wall Street. And Trump boasted about that. They want to do that to the rest of the region. But again, maybe they can do that with infrastructure, but with trade, that is very much easier said than done. It's very difficult to do because 1, China is the largest trading partner. 2, the US and China, or the US and Latin America are competitors. So what Latin America mostly exports to China is raw materials. So Brazil is the biggest exporter of iron ore, also agricultural goods. You know, Brazil and Argentina export a lot of soy and beef to China. Whereas, you know what the US exports to China? Soy and beef. So literally they're competitors. So the US is saying to Latin America, you can't trade with China. Well, who's going to buy Brazil's iron ore, beef, and soy, and, fertilizers? And I mean, it's just like, it's crazy. Like the US is actually exporting the same goods. So China is the only country big enough to actually absorb those products, to import them. So the US thinks that it can force all of these countries to cut off trade with China. It's just not going to happen.
I guess the bigger concern then is not so much, going back to the original question, the action itself of what happened in Venezuela triggering more actions like that directly, but it has acted, the blowback is that a lot of these countries in Latin America will end up going towards left-leaning governments. And then that then could become the catalyst for more action or more kind of aggressive actions from the U.S. I guess that's what everybody should be kind of more afraid of right now. But I'm kind of curious about one other thing. We all know that Trump ran on this kind of anti-war campaign not too long ago. What do you think it was that shifted, if anything? Was it always a lie? Or after he attained power, he saw how imperialism could enrich American corporations? Like, what's actually going on behind the scenes here?
Well, it was just a lie. I mean, Trump has never been anti-war and anti-interventionist. If you go back even before he was president, when you listen to his criticism of the Iraq War and the war in Libya in 2011, it was never, we shouldn't have invaded, we shouldn't have attacked. It was, we should have been more brutal and more colonial, we should have pillaged them. He literally said, I'm not exaggerating in any way, he said, in Iraq, we should have just taken all of the oil explicitly. And in Libya, he said we should have taken all of the oil. And then when he became president in his first term, what did Trump do? He bombed multiple countries, including he killed Iran's top military official, Qasem Soleimani, and the top Iraqi military official. He did not end the U.S. war in Afghanistan. As horrible as Biden was, an awful president, I'm not in any way defending him, and he oversaw the genocide in Gaza and all of that. It was actually Biden who ended the war in Afghanistan, not Trump. Trump claimed he would. He did not. Trump expanded the war in Afghanistan. He expanded the war in Yemen. He started this coup attempt in Venezuela that he's now continuing in his second term. He was waging an economic war against Venezuela. And by the way, there was a failed U.S. mercenary invasion of Venezuela in May 2020 called Operation Gideon that was overseen by Trump. So, I mean, he's never been anti-war at all. It was always just marketing. It was propaganda for people to vote for him. And then Trump supporters love to make an excuse, and they say, well, in Trump's first term, he was surrounded by the neocons and he couldn't do anything, ignoring the fact that Trump appointed those neocons. Trump appointed John Bolton, one of the worst neocons of all, as his national security advisor. And he appointed the CIA director, Mike Pompeo, as his Secretary of State. Extreme anti-China hawk, extreme neocon. Now in his second term, again, he appointed these crazy neocons. Marco Rubio is a lifelong neoconservative warmonger. He's not just the Secretary of State, but also simultaneously the acting national security advisor, which is the second time in U.S. history, the first person after Henry Kissinger who simultaneously held both positions, which means that after Trump, Marco Rubio is the second most powerful person in the government. And then Trump's head of the Pentagon, previously known as the Defense Secretary, they renamed the Pentagon the Department of War, which again shows how they don't care about peace. And now the Secretary of War is Pete Hegseth, another insane neoconservative warmonger. Pete Hegseth published a book in 2020 called American Crusade, in which he proudly identifies as a crusader. He praises the Crusades of 1,000 years ago, and he says that the U.S. is waging a holy war, that's the term he used, against three targets. Communist China. Whenever he talks about China, still today as war secretary, he always says communist China. It's his Cold War rhetoric. So that's the first target. The second is the international left, as he says. And the third target is Islam, the entire religion of 2 billion people, which, by the way, there are 1.4 million Chinese and there are 2 billion Muslims. So together, that's like almost half the world population that Pete Hegseth declared war on in this 2020 book. Like, these people are insane, unhinged warmongers. And now, in his first term as president, in his second term now, in the first year of Trump's second term, he bombed 7 countries last year. When you combine his first term and his last year, considering the time he's been president, Trump has bombed 10 countries, which means he has bombed more countries than even the hardened war criminals Obama and Biden. You know, Obama bombed a lot of countries, and Biden did too. I'm not in any way excusing them. They're also war criminals. They should all be tried at The Hague. But Trump has even he's outdone them. And by the way, last year, the Trump administration in 1 year carried out more airstrikes than Biden did in all 4 years. And again, I'm not trying to excuse Biden. Biden also is a war criminal, but just think about how crazy that is. In 1 year, Trump oversaw more bombings than Biden did in 4 years, and yet Trump claims to be a peacemaker and a peace president. I mean, it's a complete joke. Trump bombed Iran, which is what neoconservatives have been foaming at the mouth and dreaming about doing for decades. Trump actually did it, and I'm really concerned. I think they're going to do it again because Trump saw it. And he said, oh, it was so easy and there were no consequences. He thinks there are no consequences in the short term for the U.S. And the same thing with Venezuela. He thinks there are no consequences. So he's just going to go even further. And this is why the so-called peace president is expanding the military budget from 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion, which is more than the rest of the world combined. Absolutely crazy.
I wonder if there's any sort of a silver lining when you consider that both parties are war parties in the U.S. I remember an interview with Assad where he said that Trump is the best president he could ever hope for because he just says exactly what they actually want. They say that he's coming for our oil. He wants the oil. He's taking Syrian oil. And before Trump got reelected the second time, I remember in Beijing hanging out with a bunch of people who are very politically minded, and they were hoping that Trump would win. They knew that it would be a lot of short-term pain, but in their mind, it was for long-term gain because he is the kind of guy who just lets the mask slip. he says exactly what he wants. There's no fooling anybody about what this is really about in Venezuela. With his rhetoric on Greenland, this is finally getting some people in Europe to sit up in their seats. So would you go as far as saying the silver lining is that the mask is falling with Trump, and he could potentially accelerate the world towards multipolarism as everybody realizes what the U.S. is actually about?
I wouldn't call it a silver lining. I would say it's a survival strategy. But at the same time, it's also very dangerous because it makes global war, including potentially World War III, much more likely. So, yeah, it makes multipolarity more likely, but only if we all survive. And I mean, even if we, fortunately, I don't think nuclear war is still likely or on the horizon. But even if nuclear war is on the horizon, I mean, how many people will die to get to that stage? Like, that's also very unfortunate. Like, basically, I'm not in any way saying that the Democrats are like a lesser evil and everyone should have voted for Kamala Harris. I mean, they oversaw a genocide in Gaza, which, by the way, Trump is continuing. It's bipartisan, but like there's this dumb narrative. And, I was born and raised in the U.S., unfortunately. And, there's been this narrative for decades saying we have to support the Democrats. They're a lesser evil. I remember, I was politicized as a teenager when Bush invaded Iraq. It was a crazy eye-opening moment for me. And I was like, wow, I was lied to my entire childhood about the U.S. being like this peace-loving country that, is supporting the rules-based order and all that nonsense. No, it was like, I mean, for my generation, I will never forget that. That was formative for me, seeing the illegal invasion of Iraq. 1 million Iraqis died. And here we are today, and it's just like the same thing, but even more blatant on steroids. And, we've seen this gradual process of the decline of U.S. hegemony over the past 2 decades. I think that the invasion of Iraq was a big catalyst, but especially the 2008 financial crisis was an even bigger catalyst for the decline of U.S. hegemony and the multipolarization of the world. But at the same time, that decline was inevitable. And the real question was like, will that decline be like slower or very rapid? So I do agree with you that like this, by lashing out like this, by being so extremely aggressive and blatantly colonialist and honestly fascistic, Trump is accelerating the decline of U.S. hegemony more rapidly, but at a much greater cost, and it's much more dangerous. Whereas, like, with Biden, it was as horrible as it was, like with the genocide in Gaza and stuff. I mean, it became more and more obvious to the world that like this is a serious country in decline, where it's like literally a gerontocracy, where you have these people who are like in their 80s who are senile, and they're like, the emperor has no clothes. Like, Biden was not even really the president because he was just spending so much time getting medical treatment. And we could see like clearly that this is like this is a government with severe crisis. Like, there are severe issues internally. And now Trump comes in and it's just like pedal to the metal. So I don't disagree, but it's going to be very painful. And this is why I actually had a lot of debates with people, like you said. I mean, I'm in Beijing, and I did have a lot of debates with people, including people like Chinese people, but also foreigners who were like, Trump, as evil as he is, he would be better for the world because it'll show the true face of the U.S. empire to the world. But I kept saying to them, I'm like, look, it was mostly non-Americans saying this. And I'm like, look, you should not underestimate American fascism. Like, this is what it really is. Like, this is what it looks like. Like, it's extremely dangerous. And it's easy to say, oh, well, like, it will accelerate the decline of the U.S. empire and lead to a more multipolar world. But with what body count? Like, at what cost? And that's really what concerns me.
Yeah, I would have to say I'm in that camp also, where I would say that as well. But I can definitely see your point. And so from your perspective, if you had to choose, you would choose, even though you dislike both parties almost just as much, but you would choose a rather slow decline and slow realization of what America is really about under the Democrats, rather than a fast, quick pedal to the metal, quick decline, but at a very fast and quick cost with somebody like Trump.
Well, I always say we don't actually have a choice. The U.S. is not a democracy. I mean, it's an oligarchy that's been made very clear by Trump. Again, like, he showed the true face, where he invited all these billionaire oligarchs from Silicon Valley to sit with his cabinet members at his inauguration. He appointed the richest man in the world, Elon Musk, to oversee this farce of Doge and all of this. Like, there are a dozen billionaires in the Trump administration. It's the richest administration ever. I mean, but it's not just him, right? Like in every election, this is a very important fact that I often point out. In the US Congress, in the House of Representatives, candidates with more than 80% of funding win the election, and the same in the Senate. So literally, it's around 90% now. So literally, it's the best so-called democracy that money can buy. And you just see whoever has more funding wins. And, bribery is basically legal in the US because Citizens United, the Supreme Court ruling, made it so that there are no limitations on the amount of money that big corporations and rich people can give to fund politicians in the form of campaign contributions, which is legal bribery. That's illegal in most countries. So, I mean, our choice doesn't matter anyway. But so, like I said, I'm not saying that like it's a lesser evil. But what I'm saying is, for the world, the idea that like, this fascistic Trump regime that just like takes the mask off and just goes pedal to the metal, the idea that that's better for the world, I'm not entirely sure. I think they're both bad for the world. And I'm not really interested in the game of like who's a lesser evil. But what I'm saying is that like, I think a lot of people underestimated.
Right.
They believed some of Trump's propaganda. They believed, oh, he actually is less interventionist and he's more transactional. But I'm like, look, if you look at the trajectory of the Republican Party and the people he's surrounded with, like it is more and more explicitly fascistic. And yeah, not to get, there's this joke that they say that online everything, what's it called? Godwin's law. Everything online eventually becomes a Hitler comparison at some point. So I don't want to fulfill Godwin's law, but like, yeah, technically Nazi Germany led to the destruction of the German Empire. And ever since then, Germany has been a demilitarized state. But look at the massive human cost. But to be less extreme, obviously that's an extreme example. Let's look at the Ottoman Empire. Okay, the Ottoman Empire did lead the World War I and the genocide of Armenians and Greeks and Assyrians. Okay, it did lead to the end of the Ottoman Empire, but it was a massive human cost. So I am really concerned about like maybe from the perspective of people in China. I'm not saying the government. The government has always been very clear about the danger posed by U.S. militarism, and the Chinese government has been very outspoken recently and has released very good comments condemning the U.S. attack in Venezuela and such. But you and I know that talking to a lot of people in China, it is fair to say that a lot of people in China, average people in the street, they kind of preferred Trump's more vulgar imperialism over like the liberal imperialism of the Biden administration. Because, Biden would talk about the rules-based order and all this nonsense, and Blinken claimed to care about multilateralism, while the U.S. obviously didn't. And from the perspective of a lot of people in China, they kind of preferred the more vulgar, blatant imperialism because it did, make it clear to the world that the U.S. is not a responsible power and made China look better in comparison. However, I would tell to a lot of these people in China, like, okay, yeah, maybe Trump's not going to go for full-on war directly with China, but he's going to be waging wars against a lot of Chinese allies and partners like we see now. So the idea that like China is better off, I'm not entirely sure. I think either way, this is why I always emphasize that like, and I think the government recognizes this, and a lot of Chinese academics recognize this. Either way, like the target of the U.S. target in the new Cold War is China. Whether or not it's a liberal imperialist like Biden or an old school 19th century style imperialist like Trump, they're still going to continue targeting China, but in different ways. So I'm not convinced that either is like a lesser evil or a greater evil, but they're both evil.
Right. I guess the other thing to keep in mind is that for somebody in China saying that somebody like Trump is going to bring short-term pain for long-term gain, most of that pain is going to be felt by people in developing countries or like Venezuela, as we see, or the places that America is going against directly. Yeah, sure. Maybe in China, there will be some indirect impact to people's lives or the economy. But the brunt of the most violent form of that short-term pain is not going to be felt by ordinary Chinese people. And I guess that suffering that is going on now needs to be taken into consideration. I want to get back into Venezuela for a minute, because one thing I'm kind of curious about, what they pulled off seem to be too easy. And I'm seeing reports also that their weapon systems were not fired off. They were basically even turned off. How does that happen? Did they have help on the inside? Is it just speculation at this point? Like, what do you think went on to make this as easy as it seemed to have been, especially with considering their previous failed operation?
Yeah, so there are a lot of conflicting reports, and as a journalist, I always try to be very careful with hearsay. Like, I always err on the side of not repeating something if I'm not sure about it. So I would be skeptical about a lot of this stuff until it's been, more been confirmed by Venezuelan authorities or been reported by more legitimate sources. And from what I've been able to gather, yes, there are some reports that, like, for instance, Venezuela does have anti-aircraft systems that are actually Russian systems. And it's not clear if they were not used or if they malfunction or people didn't know how to use them or they weren't ready or we don't know. So I don't want to speculate about that. But I can speak about other things that have been confirmed. So originally, the narrative that came out, especially, Trump carried out this attack very early in the morning of the 3rd of January. And then a few hours later, he gave a press conference and he boasted and he said it was a zero-cost operation. No one died. What he really means is no U.S. soldiers died because, the U.S. empire doesn't see the people of Latin America as humans. In fact, we now know that more than 80 Venezuelans died, and including civilians, by the way, but many of them were soldiers and security forces. We also know that at least 30 guards and soldiers were massacred by U.S. Special Operations Forces as they kidnapped Maduro. The original narrative from the U.S. was that, we just went in, we took Maduro, no one died, we left, it was very easy. Well, now we know that's not true. There have been video and photos published by Venezuelan media outlets showing like these areas riddled with gunfire. Like, it was a complete slaughter. The U.S. massacred more than 30 guards and soldiers who were guarding President Maduro. And then they kidnapped him. I also should mention they kidnapped his wife, which is absolutely crazy. So there was resistance. There was fighting. We also know that one U.S. helicopter was fired on and was damaged. It wasn't destroyed, but it was damaged. So at least there was some firing back. But again, it's not entirely clear what happened. We also know that the U.S. bombed, in addition to kidnapping Maduro, the U.S. bombed military bases and ports and other infrastructure. And there have been reports coming out of like educational facilities that were bombed, medical facilities that were bombed. So, I mean, this was a larger operation that is being talked about. This was, a war, an invasion. Trump even said this, there were troops on the ground because a journalist asked if there will be troops on the ground. And Trump said, we're not afraid of troops on the ground. There were troops on the ground last night. So, whether, and this brings us to another question, like the level of betrayal and infiltration. The original narrative, again, a lot of this is psychological warfare, right? Like the original narrative immediately after the attack was the government fell, the Venezuelan government fell, everyone betrayed Maduro, the government's going to fall. Obviously, that's not what happened. In fact, the government has really solidified control, and it seems like pretty much all of the ministers and the vice president, who's now the acting president, Delcy Rodriguez, they're all loyal to the revolution and they're continuing. So the extent to infiltration is not clear. There have been reports that allegedly there were some parts of the military infiltrated. I mean, that does seem likely given that they were able to carry out this attack. And actually, there are reports that acting President Rodriguez has sacked one of the top generals, which is a sign that probably he was involved in some kind of treachery. So I would not be surprised if there were some people bribed. Like, Trump was offering a $50 million bounty on the head of Maduro, which is like mafia behavior. So again, no government is immune to corruption. And certainly with the economic problems in Venezuela caused by these horrific US sanctions, definitely it's an environment for corruption. But I just wanted to emphasize that like this narrative that the Venezuelan government was completely infiltrated and would fall is not true. And the idea that like there was no one who fought back is also not true. But yeah, I mean, the unfortunate message the US got is that from the US perspective, it was very low cost. And they now think that they can repeat this in other countries, which is very dangerous. Immediately after the attack in Venezuela, Trump and Rubio threatened Cuba. And now they're also threatening Colombia and, of course, threatening Greenland. So unfortunately, I would not be surprised to see if they try to repeat this kind of attack against another country. And it's like what I said earlier. The US empire is really good at beating up and destabilizing independent, small little countries. Like in 1989, the US invaded Panama. In 1983, the US invaded Grenada. And then, of course, we saw that the US invaded Iraq. In 2011, the US overthrew Libya's government, Syria. Like, these are relatively small countries, and they're really good at destroying these states and destabilizing them. They're not good at actually creating a puppet regime that serves their interests in the long term. And they're certainly not good at increasing living standards. The exact opposite. They don't care about living standards. They destroy the living standards. I mean, look what happened in Iraq. Look what happened in Libya. Still today, we're in 2026, 15 years after US-led NATO forces destroyed Libya and killed its president, Muammar Gaddafi. There's still a civil war, an ongoing civil war in Libya. So, I mean, the US is really good at destroying countries. It's not good at creating something to replace them. One final note here. There's been a debate about Maria Corina Machado, who's the main US-backed right-wing opposition leader. She was in Venezuela. She's no longer in Venezuela. And the original plan was to put her in power. And she made it clear. She said she wanted to privatize everything. She offered to sell off $1.7 trillion of assets, which is I'm very skeptical of that figure, where she got that number from. But anyway, she said she wanted to sell off the oil and the natural gas and the critical minerals and the gold and the land for tourism and the energy grid and all of that. So she's like a Javier Milei in Argentina. She's like an Ayn Rand, a libertarian type. And actually, the US has not thus far tried to put her in power. And some people are saying, oh, it's because she took the so-called Nobel Peace Prize, which, by the way, shows how much of a joke that prize is. It was used to manufacture consent for this war. But some people say that the reason that Trump didn't want to put her in power is he's angry that she accepted the Nobel Peace Prize and didn't give it to him. I think that's a ridiculous explanation. In reality, we actually, in the past few days, we've seen reports revealing the real reason. And it's because the US government, according to Reuters, which saw a classified CIA document which was given to Reuters, the CIA admitted that actually Machado is not popular in Venezuela, which I've been saying, by the way, for many months. I've been to Venezuela several times. I speak fluent Spanish. I know a lot of people there. She is not popular. Now, obviously, Maduro is also, the Venezuelan government, it's a very divided country. It's very polarized. I'm not saying like everyone in Venezuela loves the government. Basically, a lot of poor and working class Venezuelans have been supportive of the government because they've benefited from social programs. The Venezuelan government, despite the brutal sanctions and the economic issues and the high rates of inflation, they've continued the social programs. They've built more than 5 million housing units. I've personally been to some of the apartments that the government built, which is for public housing for poor and working class Venezuelans. Like, there still is a base of support, but it's definitely fair to say that like middle class Venezuelans and certainly rich Venezuelans hate the government. Many of them have left the country, but the ones who are there, they hate the government. And Machado represents the rich elites. She's from one of the richest families, an oligarch family in Venezuela. And yeah, she represents probably like 10% of the population. And yeah, she does have that base of support. But inside Venezuela, she is not popular. Even among the right-wing opposition, which is divided, there are different forces. There are other leaders who are much more popular than her because she's like the most extreme radical part of the opposition. For instance, there's another right-wing opposition leader who's more center-right named Enrique Capriles. He is much more popular than her, and he has publicly criticized her, calling her an extremist. But of course, the US doesn't like him because he doesn't want to just sell off everything to US corporations. Anyway, the reason that thus far the US hasn't tried to put her in power is they admitted that she's not popular. And according to Reuters, the CIA assessed that if they tried to put her in power, it could lead to chaos and potentially civil war. So the Trump administration essentially made this assessment that instead of trying to put a puppet in power that could lead to civil war, and I'm telling you, if they do that, there will be a civil war. Like, if they try to put Machado in power, like I know Venezuela pretty well. I've spent several months there. I'm not saying like I'm an expert, but like I know the country pretty well. There will be a lot of Venezuelans who will fight. And a lot of them have guns. In fact, the government gave a lot of them guns to these revolutionary Bolivarian revolution supporters. So they will fight. So the US government, the US regime clearly made an assessment that they think that the best way to maintain control over Venezuela is to allow the government to stay intact, but to just blackmail and threaten to kidnap or even execute the leaders of the government, like Delcy Rodriguez, like Diosdado Cabello, like Vladimir Padrino. These are the top officials, and basically tell them if they do not meet U.S. demands, the U.S. will eliminate them, and then just try to find a puppet, and then keep eliminating people until they find a puppet who will do what the U.S. wants, but still has somewhat of an element of legitimacy of not being like the far-right opposition forces that the U.S. put in power. Now, I think the strategy is not going to work. At some point, it's going to break. So the question is, because Rodriguez, she's a lifelong revolutionary. Like her dad, she and her brother are lifelong revolutionaries on the left in Venezuela. Her dad was executed by a right-wing Venezuelan regime that was backed by the U.S. Like for her, it's not just ideological, it's personal. Like she's not just going to sell out the revolution and do whatever the U.S. wants, but she's also a very smart political operative. I think she will like work out some kind of oil deal with Chevron, which, by the way, was already happening under Biden. And then Trump came in and he's like, no, we're not going to allow this. We need to have maximum pressure. We need to crush the government. Like she'll try to work out some pragmatic deal with Chevron. But the question is, Trump has other demands. He's saying that Venezuela has to cut relations with China, Russia, Iran, and Cuba. That's not going to happen. It's just not going to happen. So at some point, it's going to reach breaking point. Like, will the U.S. do the same thing? Will they like eliminate the leadership of Venezuela and try to put someone else in? Will they carry on full-on regime change? Or will Trump accept, like, he kind of forgets about it, he gets bored, and like kind of accepts that Venezuela's government is not going to be a total U.S. puppet regime, but maybe he'll accept like some larger deal where they accept like Chevron and maybe other U.S. companies to come in? Because also like there's this, I mean, if you're interested, we can get into a longer discussion about like the state of Venezuelan oil infrastructure, which has been in very bad state because it needs to be repaired and updated because of the U.S. sanctions, because Venezuela nationalized its oil industry. But all of that technology was from U.S. and European companies, and the sanctions that started under Obama in 2015 and were massively expanded by Trump starting in 2017, those sanctions prevented Venezuela from importing a lot of the capital goods and the equipment and the chemicals needed to like maintain its own oil industry and to refine its oil. Like Venezuela is a small country in the global south. They don't have oil drilling companies. They don't have like, they have very heavy crude. They don't have the light crude that they need and the chemicals like naphtha they need to process their own oil. So the sanctions have led to a complete degradation of the oil industry. So like there could be some kind of deal made where the Venezuelan government still gets like proceeds from these deals, but like US companies do invest to help to fix up the equipment. Basically what that would mean is partial sanctions relief in return for allowing US companies to invest. That's a potentially more realistic scenario. And maybe like if the more realistic forces in the Trump administration who are not extremely ideological, they could see that as like the best case scenario, because the other like insane maniacs, like for instance, Stephen Miller, who's just like going out on CNN and saying, we control Latin America. We're the most powerful country. It's time that we act like a superpower and control everything. That's not going to work. So from like a more pragmatic imperialist perspective, from like the perspective of US oil corporations, I think they would actually prefer that kind of like more middle ground scenario, because if the U.S. thinks they can just eliminate the entire leadership and put a puppet regime in the medium to the long term, it's just going to lead to more chaos, and it's actually not going to be conducive to these U.S. companies, which, by the way, is why a lot of these U.S. companies are still hesitant about going in. Like they want Venezuela's oil, but they understand that they have to invest, billions of dollars in upgrading the infrastructure and fixing the broken equipment, and that means that you have all this upfront capital expenditure, and you don't start getting returns for several years. And who knows what the situation will look like in several years if Venezuela becomes a new Libya.
It's incredible that even before all of this happened, there was a pathway to potential leadership in Venezuela accepting the fact that they needed to make a deal with American private oil and gas companies in order
Maduro
to
did that, by
survive.
the way, with
Yeah,
Chevron under Biden.
right. You're right. So there was a pathway to that. And that in itself is already ridiculous enough that in order to survive, you need to come to some sort of a deal with these American private corporations. Then to go one step further and say, okay, you have to break off your ties with Russia, you have to break off your ties with China, just takes it to a whole new level. So, who knows? Maybe they come back to that point that they could have got to without all of this show anyways. But that leads me to a question that I'm curious about. Many of the voices online that are supportive of what the US did said that this actually acts as an example as to why countries can't rely on China or Russia because they didn't show up to help. So what do you think about this argument?
It's a complicated issue because, look, a lot of people love to criticize China and Russia for not intervening, but what would that look like? It could be World War III. Like, think about it from the perspective of China and Russia. Like, yes, Venezuela is an important partner for them. In fact, recently, China and Venezuela signed an all-weather comprehensive strategic partnership, which is the same level as Pakistan. Like, very important partner. But think about it from the perspective of China. Like, obviously, they're very angry about this. But let's say China sent, like, people keep saying, first of all, China does not intervene. It doesn't. Like, this is a principle for China's foreign policy. And in most cases, it's a good thing, right? Most countries, that's why they like China. They don't want another country like the US intervening. In some cases, people say can be a bad thing because, like, look, the genocide in Gaza, China did not directly intervene. But again, like, China's not going to risk a war with the US because of Gaza. Unfortunately, like, that's the reality. Like, China, they're not going to do that. China's certainly not going to risk a war with the US in Latin America to help to defend these countries in Latin America. And maybe, like, yeah, I have no doubt that Venezuela would have welcomed China or Russia to send military forces. Like, from Venezuela's perspective, they would love that. But they also recognize that this would lead probably to significant escalation and potentially a war between the US and China. That's not going to happen. China, it just doesn't do that. Russia is already dealing with basically fighting a proxy war against the US and NATO in Ukraine. So, like, unfortunately, at the end of the day, like, yes, politically and economically, China and Russia have been very supportive to these countries. And honestly, the Venezuelan government probably would have fallen were it not for support from China, Russia, and Iran. First of all, the US was previously the biggest purchaser of Venezuelan oil. I already talked about how, like, the US imports a lot of heavy crude, and Venezuela is a big producer of heavy crude. That was before the very aggressive sanctions that started under 2015 and continued under Trump in his first term. So, Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years. Right-wingers love to say Venezuela collapsed because socialism and blah, blah, blah. Venezuela has been a petrostate for 100 years, before Hugo Chavez was born. Imagine what would happen if Saudi Arabia was sanctioned and blockaded by the US, was unable to export its oil, was unable to import the machinery and equipment it needed, and that skilled workers to upgrade to fix its oil infrastructure. The Venezuelan the Saudi monarchy would collapse in, like, weeks. There's no way the Saudi monarchy would survive that. The Venezuelan government has survived these sanctions for 11 years now. So, like, that's a testament to the fact that there still is a base of support for the government. We can see this in the streets now. There are protests. Again, I'm not saying that, like, it's a very divided country. I've seen it. Like, there are people who are willing to fight for the government, and there are a lot of people who tend to be wealthy people who absolutely despise the government and who did welcome in this US invasion, also because they want to get that oil proceeds that they used to get, that they lost. So, yeah, it's a divided country, but, like, the reason that the Venezuelan government was able to survive is not only because it does have some support, but also because China bought 80% of its oil. So Venezuela could no longer export its oil to the US, and oil output did fall significantly. It used to be over 2 million barrels before, like, this really aggressive blockade Trump imposed on Venezuela in his first term. And it fell to under 1 million barrels per day at the peak of the Trump coup attempt in 2019 and 2020. And then in the past few years, it's been slightly recovering, and it's now more than 1 million barrels per day. And China was buying 80% of that. So that was like a source of revenue for the Venezuelan government. And now the US says China can no longer sell oil to China, and the US is going to buy it. And then Trump says he'll control what it does with that oil. Well, but then Trump also said that the US is going to take, he didn't say buy, he said take, but then he also said buy. He's been very contradictory. 30 to 50 million barrels of oil from Venezuela. Well, Venezuela is producing now like a little over 1 million per day. So that's like 30 to 50 days worth of Venezuelan oil production. But what about the other 300 days of oil production? Like, where's that going to go? But then the US says Venezuela can't sell its oil to China, but China buys 80%. So again, it's like, it's very unclear what's happening here. But anyway, getting back to your question, the point I'm saying is that like Venezuela, the reason it was able to hold on is because of trade with China, economic and political support from China and Russia, and also Iran. By the way, Iran's a country that's been under sanctions since 1979. Iran is a major oil producer as well. And Iran has actually been able to kind of develop its own domestic oil technology and drilling infrastructure. So actually, Iranian engineers and technicians, a lot of them went to Venezuela to help Venezuela at least try to like fix up and operate its oil infrastructure to the extent that it could. So that support has been critical. But again, like, unfortunately, like, you can't change the iron laws of geopolitics. Like, China and Russia's already bogged down with this proxy war in Ukraine. China does not intervene as on principle, and China's not going to risk like a larger military conflict with the US. China's already trying to like reduce tensions with the US because it's afraid of like a potential conflict. And basically, people need to think more realistically. Like, obviously, you know, my heart is in Latin America. I spent a lot of time living there, and I have so many friends, and like I really love Latin America. And obviously, like, this for me is just like, it's so painful seeing what the US is doing. But I also understand that, like, realistically, and I think the Venezuelan government also understands realistically, China is not going to risk a war with the US to help Venezuela. That's unfortunately the reality of the world.
You know, it's really interesting because these same people who are saying this, that this shows that you can't rely on China, these are the same people that have always tried to paint China as an aggressive power. And we are the people who always tell them, no, they are non-interventionists. They don't get involved in this stuff. And then they're saying, you see, they didn't get involved. It's like, this is what we've been telling you all along. They don't intervene. This is their red line. They're not going to cross it. But does this potentially create a problem where global South countries that are dealing with China and then all of a sudden find themselves in America's crosshairs? Would this potentially be a warning to them and a signal to them that, well, they might as well give up their relationship with China and try their best to come to a deal with the US, because eventually it could get to a point where a red line is crossed that China is not going to join you there, and you're going to have to give up what you have to the US anyways. Do you know what I mean? Like, does this potentially discourage in any sort of a meaningful way from these global South countries from dealing with China because of this risk that exists now?
Yes, this is a big debate going on. I can say, as you know, a PhD candidate at Tsinghua University, the top Chinese university, like, these are the debates that a lot of Chinese academics are having right now. And it's a very complicated issue because I really understand both perspectives. Because as we've been talking about, the People's Republic of China, throughout its history, despite the changes in leadership and the changes in policies, one consistency from 1949, the founding of the PRC, until today, in the Mao era, in the Deng era, and in the Xi era, a consistency has been opposition to hegemony and a clear reluctance to get involved in foreign conflicts and to meddle abroad. Obviously, we did see that in the Mao era, China did intervene in support of Korea with the U.S. Korean War, the U.S. invasion of Korea. So that was an intervention because China was also afraid, you know, Korea is right on its border, that if the U.S. succeeded in taking over all of Korea, that it would then use that as a launch pad for a war on China. This is, of course, the U.S. invasion of Korea came 1 year after the victory, several months after the victory of the Chinese Revolution in October 1949. So That was a matter of national security. And then, of course, we saw the last war that China was involved in, which is a very unfortunate war, was 1979. By the way, I should emphasize that point. China has not fought a war since 1979, which was basically a border issue. Like it had some temporary border conflicts with India. These are border issues. China did have a very brief war with Vietnam, very tragic war in 1979. But basically, that was an extension of the US and European wars in Southeast Asia, in Vietnam and Cambodia and Laos. So that was the last war that China fought. It does not want to fight wars. So this has been a consistent part of its foreign policy, is opposition to that. And another big part of China's foreign policy is China does not have formal military alliances. It does not. The only country, I believe, people can fact check me on this, but I'm pretty sure the only country that technically has a formal military alliance with China is actually the DPRK, North Korea, which goes back to the Korean War era. But I think that's the only country. Otherwise, it does not. And now the question is, will China be...
Solomon Islands might have some sort of level of cooperation, but it's probably not as deep.
But it's not a military alliance. Like formal military alliance.
It's a police,
in the
more
sense
of a police,
that...
Yeah.
Yeah, if a formal military alliance in the sense like NATO... NATO has Article 5.
Right.
If a NATO member is attacked, the other NATO members have to get involved. China obviously doesn't want that, because if one of its partners is attacked, they would have to get involved, right? Like if it had a formal military pact with Venezuela, it would have to get involved with Venezuela, which could potentially mean war with the US. Like the escalation risk is obviously very high. So I think the only country that has one technically is DPRK, but also the DPRK now has a military alliance with Russia. So, and also the DPRK has nuclear weapons. So like the US is not going to, by the way, this is the message that Iran is certainly taking from what's happening in Venezuela. Get nukes as fast as possible. And I would not be surprised if other countries were taking the same lesson. But anyway, getting back to this issue of, there's a big debate happening right now in China about whether or not China will be forced to actually have more military pacts. Obviously, this is something that the PRC has always wanted to avoid, because from their perspective, which I disagree with, but Mao was very critical of the Soviet Union. I think some of his criticisms were fair and some of them were unfair. But from China's perspective, they saw the Soviet Union as a big threat. And they also saw the Soviet Union as an imperialist power. I disagree with that. It's not true. But I understand China's perspective in the Mao era. And they saw the Soviet Union's military alliances and, for instance, support for Cuba, giving nuclear weapons to Cuba to defend Cuba after a U.S. invasion, after the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961. China saw this as a kind of another form of imperialism. They called it social imperialism as opposed to capitalist imperialism. So China had this position: we don't want to be the new Soviet Union. We don't want new military pacts. And despite the economic differences between China today, after Deng Xiaoping started the reform and opening up in 1978, despite those economic differences and the market reforms, that is a consistency from the Mao era. China does not want to be seen as a social imperialist power. However, we're now coming up to the reality of geopolitics, which you just talked about. Like, at some point, if your partners are being destabilized and attacked and overthrown, at some point you have to take action. So I think this is going to be the debate happening in China, and no one knows what will happen. But what I will say is this: I don't know if China will start having formal military alliances, because that is like kind of a sacrosanct issue for them. Like they don't want to do that. But I would not be surprised at all if they don't already have informal military pacts. Because if you have a written military agreement, it says that like you have to do something if, like, let's say Pakistan is attacked. Obviously, China has to be very careful with that, because the most likely scenario is a Pakistan war with India. And China is trying to improve its relations with India. And they're both in BRICS. And actually, they have improved relations recently. So China does not want to be dragged into a war to defend Pakistan against India, which would be catastrophic. So like in that case, obviously that's a more difficult scenario. But other countries in Asia that are like on China's border, I would not be surprised if like some more friendly countries that have very close relations with China, if they come to some kind of informal military agreement where if like they're attacked, that China will help them. Now, unfortunately, the reality of geopolitics is like Latin America is on the other side of the world. China does not have foreign military bases. China has one foreign military base in Djibouti, which is for foreign military for anti-piracy operations, excuse me. And many other countries, by the way, including Italy, has a foreign military base in Djibouti. Again, China, it's very important for China not to be perceived as an imperialist power. So they're very hesitant about getting involved militarily around the world because they don't want to be, they don't want to repeat what they see as the mistakes made by the Soviet Union. However, at some point, if the US is saying like, we're just going to attack all of these countries and no one will stop us, eventually China may have to stop, may have to step in like they did in Korea. But again, I mean, it's a very difficult scenario, and this is a huge debate happening. I can tell you, Chinese academics who are influential in China, it's not like the US, like where they're ignored. In China, influential academics are often advisors to the government. They're having a big debate about this now. And you can I mean, no one knows what's happening. Non-Chinese people don't know what's happening inside, Chinese political circles. By the way, this is a lesson. Any of these Western journalists who claim they have like a source in the Chinese government, it's a lie. They do not. Like, no, they don't. Like, even Chinese people do not have sources unless they work in the government. They do not have sources in the government. Like that's their security culture is very strong. So no one really knows, but certainly within like intellectual circles in China, this is a big debate happening.
Yeah, it really is a difficult situation because part of the draw to China for so many countries is that they stay in their own business. They don't get involved in other countries. But like you said, what do they do when their partners are being destabilized one by one? Destabilized. It's a difficult question. On the topic of Russia,
I forgot to say one thing. I know I have a tendency to give long answers, but very short answer here.
Yeah.
Some people were really angry that China and Russia did not more directly intervene in Syria. But at that point, I mean, Syria was already militarily occupied by foreign-backed extremists and all this stuff. And like the government was on the verge of collapse. And like Russia had intervened. And like, I mean, they could not have saved the government at that point. And then also, people say Iran, because it's clear that the U.S. target, the next target is Iran. And people say, why didn't China or Russia do anything? Well, they were also kind of waiting to see what would happen, right? And obviously, it was short term. It was 1 week. Well, I guess 2 weeks with Israel, but like the U.S. attacks. And I would not be surprised, like we're talking about like where that potential change could be. Unfortunately, I don't think it's going to be in Latin America because China, again, like they don't even have the means to send military support to Latin America. Iran is a different scenario. So if there is a change in this Chinese policy, I think it could be Iran. If there's some kind of larger conflict, if there's a war that the U.S. starts waging again against Iran, which is very possible this year or in the next few years. In that scenario, I don't necessarily see like China sending troops, but you can bet that like in the past several months, China and Russia have been providing a lot of military support to Iran, a lot of weapons, a lot of military equipment, a lot of drones. Like, obviously, we know that China's strategy, going back to Deng, is to maintain a low profile to bide your time. So China, by tendency, it does not boast about these things. It doesn't announce them. But you can bet that, like, quietly, they have been boosting military support from Iran. And I would not be surprised if they're kind of doing this with a few other countries in Asia. So we should also remember that, like, China is not going to publicly announce this stuff if it is already happening.
Right. Yeah. I guess it's a good thing that they waited for that 1 week to see what would have happened, because if they did get involved, it could have spiraled out of control into something bigger. But on the other hand, too, that 1 week where absolutely there were no consequences for the U.S. could have acted as their trial period, where then they go ahead with something bigger in the future. And like you said, going back to something you said earlier about, North Korea is the example to Iran. I remember it was quite a long time ago. I heard somebody asking, it was a kid asking their parent or something like that, saying, hey, we're going to Iraq because we think they have weapons of mass destruction. Well, why aren't we going after North Korea? It's because we know they actually have weapons of mass destruction. This is what actually prevents them from being overthrown. Talking about Russia, though, and also online comments again, it's interesting to see online how many people who rejected Russia's premise for entering Ukraine and the idea of any reasonable security threat, despite it being pretty easy to demonstrate to anyone with their eyes open that there was a real security threat. They completely rejected that premise, yet they're supportive of what the U.S. did in Venezuela on the back of a story which requires far more imagination. And when it's obviously clearly driven by reappropriating their resources, it makes for a pretty epic display of hypocrisy. But what I'm wondering is it also hypocritical in the other direction for people who empathized with Russia or even outright supported what Russia did, yet denounce what the U.S. did in Venezuela? Are they too hypocritical? If not, why?
I wouldn't say hypocritical, but obviously, again, it's a complex scenario, right? I think China's position on Ukraine has been the best position, which is China has not openly endorsed this, military operation in this conflict, and China has always played a very important role in trying to facilitate the end of it. However, China has always maintained and emphasized that it's not just Russia that just started this conflict, that this conflict was ultimately started by NATO expansion, by U.S. meddling in Ukraine, and the U.S.-backed coup that overthrew Ukraine's independent government in 2014 and installed a pro-Western regime that vowed to join NATO and started this war. China has always emphasized that all parties are involved, and it's not just Russia that just unilaterally one day decided, oh, we're gonna, launch a war. No, the war started in 2014 after the U.S. overthrew Ukraine's government, and then in the Donbass in the east, there started a civil war against, in Ukraine, the majority of the population in the east was ethnically Russian, and they were pro-Russia, and there was this war that started, and literally tens of thousands of people died before this new phase of the war with, it was a Russian invasion. According to international law, it was an invasion in 2022. But we need to understand this larger context. The war did not start in February 2022. It started in 2014 with a U.S. basically invasion, with the overthrow of the sovereign independent government of Ukraine, not dissimilar to what they're doing in Venezuela. And then the U.S. militarized Ukraine. They started doing NATO military exercises, even though Ukraine technically was not a member of NATO. There were literally U.S. troops on the ground in NATO starting in 2014. They became a de facto member of NATO. They were militarizing the country. The U.S. was flooding Ukraine with weapons to fight this proxy war in the eastern part of Ukraine. Tens of thousands of Ukrainians died. And then, yes, this new phase of the war started in 2022, which is horrific. I mean, absolutely horrific. And like I said, I'm certainly not a fan of what's been going on at all. And I think it's actually sad. Obviously, I think the U.S. and NATO bear the main responsibility, but I also find it a little unpalatable when people just even on the other side, people cheer on all of the deaths and we have to crush Ukraine and all this. No, I mean, this is a tragedy for everyone, and the war should end as soon as possible. But the U.S., and now especially Europe, they don't want the war to end. Famously, Josep Borrell, the former head of foreign policy of the EU, he said that there will only be a military solution to this conflict. So, they've been fueling this war. They don't want the war to end. So it's a complete tragedy. And I think China's position has been the most sensible. The US and NATO bear the main responsibility, and it's not all, on Russia's shoulders. And the only way to actually have peace is to have security guarantees for Russia and guarantees that Ukraine will never join NATO and will be neutral. And NATO and the West refuse that. So it's very different from what's happening in Venezuela. Again, people love to make these comparisons. It's very different. Obviously, you pointed out the hypocrisy. There's extreme hypocrisy of these Europeans who are condemning Russia for violating Ukraine's sovereignty, and yet at the same time they say, "Oh, we support the U.S. invasion of Venezuela." I mean, that hypocrisy is just so blatant. Macron, for instance, he openly praised the kidnapping of President Maduro, the internationally recognized president. Absolutely crazy. And then Macron is the one constantly condemning Russia every single day. That's just blatant hypocrisy. But then there are other people who make a more sophisticated argument, and they say, well, if you don't condemn Russia, but you condemn the U.S., you're also being hypocritical. But like I said, it's a much more complex scenario. Russia's dealing with this conflict that started with the US coup in 2014. And there was already a war that started in 2014. The war did not start in 2022. Whereas the US just invaded Venezuela, which is not even its neighbor, by the way. The US invaded Venezuela and kidnapped the internationally recognized president. Did Putin kidnap Zelensky? No, Zelensky's still in Kiev. Like, these are not comparable situations.
Right.
They're completely different. And the people saying that, like, you have to be consistent, you have to both condemn Russia and to condemn the US. It's like the people who say, oh, well, if you support Palestine, you also should support Ukraine, which is absurd, by the way, because I should point out, Ukraine itself supported the US invasion of Venezuela, which is hilarious because Ukraine says Russia's the aggressor, NATO's the hero. Ukraine's foreign minister praised the US government for invading Venezuela and kidnapping its internationally recognized president. So does that mean that, like, now Putin can kidnap Zelensky? And moreover, Ukraine supported the genocide in Gaza. Ukraine is very pro-Israel and supports the US colonizing Palestine. So this is the reality of geopolitics. This is how this is what real geopolitics looks like. And these people in Europe, these center left social democrats who say, well, yes, we support Palestine, but in order to consistently support Palestine, you have to also support Ukraine. Well, Ukraine doesn't support Palestine. I mean, this is an infantile argument that does not understand how geopolitics actually works.
Yeah, and I suppose you could go one step further and say those who don't necessarily support what Russia did, but empathize with the situation, for them, what happened in Venezuela, which is not even a neighbor of the U.S., like you said, actually re-emphasizes why you don't want the U.S. on your border. When the U.S. does this kind of thing, you don't want their military alliances and their military presence, and their military alliance that's praising what they did in Venezuela also, on your border. I mean, Canada is learning pretty quickly also. Even having them literally, physically on your border comes with risks also. So if anything, there's something to even strengthen that argument. Let's wrap up with this. Let's wrap up with talking about, I know it's early days and it's difficult to say what will happen, but what do you think happens next with Venezuela and the region in general? Is there any hope for Latin America to escape this renewed focus on the Monroe Doctrine, or the Donroe Doctrine, as they're now calling it?
It's a very dark moment because the message from the Trump administration, openly, they're not hiding it. Stephen Miller did an insane interview on CNN where he said, we are a superpower. We're the most powerful country in the world. We control Latin America. It's our hemisphere. We will do whatever we want to control the region, period. So they're just blatant colonialists at this point. It's even worse than just imperialism, which is bad enough. It's straight up 19th century style colonialism. They're saying we control all of the territory of all this region, all the natural resources, all the infrastructure, and we will overthrow any governments we don't like. Now, we talked about how this puts China and Russia in a very difficult situation because, they have partners who certainly would invite, like Brazil might invite Chinese military forces to use their bases, right? I don't think China will do that because they don't want to risk escalating into a larger conflict with the US and potentially World War III. And again, we talked about how that's not China's policy. They are non-interventionist. But essentially what we're seeing across the region in Latin America is governments are afraid, honestly. And that's why they're, speaking out so vociferously, especially Brazil, which is the largest country. And Trump has already threatened Lula. He threatened Colombia's president, Petro. Petro actually gave a speech and he said, if the U.S. invades Colombia, I will take up arms against the U.S. So, it's a very dangerous moment. And the only real solution would be Latin American unity and preparing for a potential war with the U.S. Because that's what the U.S. is saying, is that, like, we're going to invade you and overthrow your governments. Like I said, the U.S. thinks that it can just bully these countries around and threaten them and overthrow their leaders. But when push comes to shove, the U.S., in order to control these countries, yeah, it can try to assassinate their leaders and bomb them. But if the U.S. really wants to maintain control of them, it would have to send in troops on the ground longer term to occupy them. And we saw how that worked in Iraq. We saw how it worked in Afghanistan. And in Latin America, I can assure you, there will be a lot of people who will fight back. So unfortunately, in terms of like these grotesque threats of, kidnapping leaders and invading and bombing without troops on the ground, like there's not much they can do. But in the medium to the long term, if the US tries to carry on full on military occupations, that's not going to go well. And there are going to be a lot of US soldiers who go back in body bags, which is actually probably why they won't do that. This is why Trump doesn't want a lot of troops on the ground. So instead, they're going to do what they've been doing in Gaza. They love, just bombing women and children and destroying everything to get what they want. But like I said, look at what happened in Libya. They were very successful in destroying the government. They were not successful in taking control of the country. Still today, 15 years later, there's a civil war in Libya. And by the way, one other quick point I'll make before we conclude. Trump loves to complain about immigration and scapegoat and Latino immigrants. Look what happened in Europe after the US invaded Iraq. It waged war in Syria. It overthrew the government of Libya. It waged war in Yemen. It invaded Afghanistan. There was the biggest immigration crisis since World War II, the biggest refugee crisis since World War II. Tens of millions of people were displaced, and many of them went to Europe and caused this refugee crisis that also led to the rise of far-right groups and anti-immigrant groups. Now, the U.S. has been waging an economic war against Venezuela for 11 years now, since Obama started the sanctions in 2015. And we saw, a lot of immigrants leaving Venezuela because of the economic crisis caused by the U.S. sanctions. But imagine if the U.S. continues waging war in Venezuela, expands that war to Colombia, Cuba, Brazil, Nicaragua, who else knows where. I mean, imagine we're talking about tens of millions of people being displaced. And a lot of them are trying to go to the U.S., fueling much more mass migration, which is, again, like what Trump is obsessed with stopping. So, the U.S. would love destabilizing the Middle East, West Asia, because it didn't have to deal with most of the consequences of those immigrants and refugees leaving. But the U.S. is quite close to Latin America, and imagine what the consequences would be.
Right. Now, you say that, I know I said that was the last question, but to pick up on one of your points, you said one of the possible defense mechanisms against this renewed Monroe Doctrine is Latin American unity. How likely is that? I mean, you know the region pretty well. Was it not very likely before? Is it potentially more likely now in the face of what happened? Is that a feasible thing that could happen?
Well, there's an interesting historical parallel here. The peak of Latin American regional integration was in the 2000s. And a lot of it was in response to, it was fueled by George W. Bush's extreme overt imperialism. And this led to the rise of people like Hugo Chavez. And then in Argentina, you had the Kirchners. In Ecuador, you had Rafael Correa. In Brazil, you had Lula and then Dilma. I mean, Chile also had a left-leaning government. So this was the kind of peak of Latin American unity. And it was when we saw organizations created to unify Latin America, like the Community of Latin American and Caribbean States, CELAC, which was created as an alternative to the US-dominated Organization of American States, the OAS, which is based in Washington and controlled by Washington. So the CELAC was created to unify Latin America and the Caribbean. And then also the ALBA, the Bolivarian Alliance for the Peoples of Our America, was an economic alliance, which, by the way, was trying to de-dollarize 20 years ago. De-dollarization has become a hot topic today, but in the 2000s, the ALBA was experimenting with making a new currency called the Sucre for regional trade, so they can no longer to try to cut out the US dollar. And the US response was to try to destabilize those governments, to force them to withdraw from the ALBA and such. So the point I'm getting at is that the kind of peak of that unity was actually in response to Bush's very aggressive attacks. So I would not be surprised if Trump's very aggressive attacks lead to kind of a resurgence of the Latin American left, which is always anti-imperialist and, supporting regional unity. However, in the short term, in the immediate term, it's not going to happen because you have a series of very right-wing governments that are very pro-US. And sometimes people like to criticize me and they say, Ben, the geopolitical analysis of Latin America, just making it about left-right divide is too simple. It's not that simple. Well, in some other regions of the world, that may be true, but in Latin America, it's very simple. The left-wing governments, almost all of them, are very critical of the US and very pro-China and very pro-BRICS. And the right-wing governments are all very pro-US because, they're run by a bunch of corporate elites many of them work for US corporations. For instance, in Argentina, Javier Milei worked in the financial sector, and his minister of the economy and the head of multiple government ministers, the head of the central bank, worked for JP Morgan on Wall Street. Like, they're all, in the case of Latin America, it's very clear. Argentina has a very pro-US right-wing government. Chile has an incoming, very far-right pro-US government, which the leader, Jose Antonio Cast, is a big defender of the Pinochet dictatorship. He's coming in. He's very anti-China, very pro-US. In Peru has a right-wing pro-US government. Ecuador has a right-wing pro-US government. So the region is divided, but the biggest countries in the region have left-leaning pro-China governments that are very critical of the US, including Brazil and also Mexico. Mexico's situation is more complicated because Mexico has a big border with the US. 80% of Mexico's exports go to the US, but Mexico's government now is very non-aligned in terms of its foreign policy, and they're very impressive what they've been able to accomplish. First under President AMLO, Andrés Manuel López Obrador, and now under President Claudia Sheinbaum. So, and then certainly Brazil, which is the juggernaut in the region, the biggest country, the biggest economy, a founding member of BRICS. Lula is up for re-election, and I think, again, if the U.S. doesn't do something really crazy, like assassinate or kidnap him, he's almost certainly going to win that election. So like I said, the U.S. thinks it's going to be easy to control this region, but the more it attacks, actually, the more it could invite resistance.
I wonder if even with somebody like Milei, who's on the right, though, if this changes his calculus also. Because, of course, he came to power very, very anti-China, talking about he'd never deal with commies. But then after he came into power, he said, we need to trade more with China. They just buy our stuff and they don't ask anything of us. So I guess with the rise of China, that may disrupt that traditional balance between this, left wing is pro-China, right wing is completely anti-China. I guess that doesn't necessarily mean Milei is still not anti-China, but when it comes to trade, it's hard to ignore the fact that it's going to be difficult to survive in this world without having a significant trade relationship with China.
Well, this is what I was saying earlier. There's a difference between political relations and economic relations. Like I said, China is the largest trading partner of South America. Politically, many of these right-wing governments are overtly anti-China. They speak publicly out against China, but they trade a lot with China. By the way, China is the third largest U.S. trading partner. They just waged a trade war. The U.S. is waging a new Cold War against China. They're still their third largest trading partner. Trade is very complicated, right? This is why China always emphasizes that trade should not be politicized and weaponized. So in the case of Latin America, you're right. And this is the point I made at the beginning. The Trump administration is not only saying to countries in Latin America, you have to cut off political ties, which is already imperialism and absurd, but they're now saying you have to cut off economic ties and trade, which is just not going to happen. It's impossible because, as I said, what Latin America exports to China is what the U.S. also exports to China. The U.S. is a major agricultural exporter. It's a major exporter of oil and gas, and it competes with Latin America. The U.S. is a net exporter of oil and gas. It does want heavy crude from Venezuela, but Brazil is a major exporter of oil, and Colombia is a major exporter of oil, and Ecuador is an exporter of oil. The U.S. doesn't need to import all of that oil. Trump says he wants to take it and control where it's sold. But soybeans is another good example. So the U.S. is a major exporter of soybeans. And when Trump started this new phase of the trade war against China, China said, okay, we're not going to buy soybeans from U.S. farmers. So instead, China bought more soybeans from Brazilian and Argentine farmers. And then Trump was forced to make this agreement in Busan, South Korea, where China said, okay, we'll buy more soybeans from U.S. farmers. Meanwhile, we saw for months that U.S. soybean farmers had all these soybeans that were ready, that were rotting because no one would buy them. Latin America is not going to buy them. Africa is not going to buy them. China is the only market big enough to buy them. And yet Brazil and Argentina are also huge exporters of soybeans. So this idea that the Trump administration has that they can cut off trade with China is not going to happen in a million years. Politically, it's different. Like I said, politically, I think these right-wing governments in the region, they will withdraw from Belt and Road. They will If there are infrastructure projects that China is working on, they might stop those projects. They will not, like, politically, they will join the US in attacking China and like votes at the UN and stuff. But economically, I agree with you, because the reality is that the US cannot replace China as a trade partner for these countries.
Exactly. Yeah. No, that's a good explanation. And we've covered a lot of ground. Thank you so much for that. Thank you, everybody, for joining. Once again, if you want to go into even more detail on some of the points we summarized, go over to the Geopolitical Economy Report and check out Ben's videos. Ben, thank you so much for that detailed analysis, and we'll catch you next time.
Yeah, my pleasure, Daniel. Thanks. Keep up the good work.